Okay, everybody, I want to welcome you to Magnolia United Church of Christ learning session. So in January, our congregation decided that we were going to take an intentional focus to learn about homelessness and to see about ways that we could work to end homelessness. To that end, one of the learning forums we decided to do was to dive into the causes of homelessness. And we are just so fortunate tonight to welcome Dr. Greg Colburn from the University of Washington. So Dr. Colburn is an assistant professor of real estate in the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. And he has a PhD in public affairs from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And his research interests include housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. And Dr. Colburn is the author of the forthcoming book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. So we're going to invite Dr. Colburn to give a presentation, but also have some time for question and answer. So I think if I have this correct, we will allow, if possible, questions during the presentation. If you want to pop them in chat, I can watch those and bring them to his attention. So feel free to use that chat function. And we are recording this session just as an FYI. We had many people who weren't able to attend who did want the recording. So with that being said, I want to say welcome. It is good you all are here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Colburn.
Thank you, Marcy, very much. I appreciate the invitation, and good evening to all of you. I'm happy to be joining you for your learning session. I'm going to share my slides here. And if you do have questions as I'm speaking, feel free to ask. But I will probably speak for about a half hour, and then I look forward to hearing your comments and questions afterwards, and we can have more of a discussion. So we won't spend the whole hour with me talking at you. That is not the intent here. So as Marcy mentioned, I'm at the University of Washington. My family and I moved out here in 2017 when I got the job at UW. I'm a second career academic. My first career was in finance. I worked in New York and Chicago in the investment fields for about 17 years, and then quit as I was approaching my 40th birthday and got my PhD because I'd always wanted to be a professor, and here I am. So it's been a really fun and interesting journey. And the reason why I mention that is I have this prior career, and so I do bring a market perspective to my work. And when I think about issues of inequality and access to housing, given that we live in a market-based economy, I really think it's important that we think about some of these market dynamics in understanding some of the conditions that we see in our communities. And I think housing is a clear example of that relationship between market conditions and some of the social problems that we observe and things that we care about and hopefully want to address. So the reason I wrote this book in partnership with Clayton Alder, and Clayton is a journalist now, and he writes a lot on environmental concerns, but he's just a really, really smart, thoughtful person. And so a lot of the data visuals that you'll see are his handiwork. He's far better at those things than I am. And so we formed a really nice partnership for this particular book. But the reason I wanted to write the book was, as I mentioned, I got to Seattle in 2017 and got engaged in housing related issues in the community right away. And as I was meeting with elected leaders, civic leaders, nonprofits, philanthropy, et cetera, I observed in all these meetings that there was not a consistent understanding or belief about what the root causes of our homelessness crisis were in Seattle. And as I watched this develop over time, I got concerned that our lack of a proper diagnosis was hindering our efforts to address the problem and hopefully end it. And if you've ever played the game whack-a-mole, if you had kids playing whack-a-mole, I felt like we were always playing whack-a-mole around this issue. We had this cause, that cause, we'd hit this one, we'd hit that one, and it was kind of a never-ending game. And as a result, I just didn't sense that our community, that being the city, the county, our state, had a unified understanding of the issue and a unified structural response to address it. And as a result, we kept falling further and further behind. Now we're doing good work. We're investing dollars, and the people tasked with with spending those dollars, I believe are doing good work, but the scale isn't sufficient to address the problem. And therefore, for the casual observer who's walking around Seattle right now, says, what is going on? This problem keeps getting worse. We're spending money. What's happening? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more tonight. But if you find yourself in that camp, you're not alone. And so I wanted to write the book for a general audience. And so this is not a conventional academic book written for other professors. You know, as I was writing, I had my folks in mind, my parents. They're both college educated. They're not social scientists. I wanted it to be written in a way that they would find it interesting and perfectly accessible. And so if you find yourself in that camp of just interested civic participant, this is hopefully a book for you. So I'm going to go over the main arguments that I make in the book. Obviously, this is a brief summary of it. If you're more deeply interested, obviously, I would welcome you to take a read when it's out. It'll be out in March. March 15th is the release date. So it's been a long process. I found out that publishing a book is a longer gestation period than birthing children, which I always joke around with my wife about. This took longer than our kids to show up. So when we start to talk about causes of homelessness, which is one of the topics of this particular book, causes is something that professors and social scientists think a lot about. And causation is difficult. Sometimes in the physical sciences, causes are easier to understand. If I drop a pencil, I think most of us would say the cause of that was gravity, right? But when we start to think about other more complex things, like what caused someone to be admitted to Harvard or not get into Harvard? Well, a lot of things went on, right? Well, their parents are on the board, or the parents gave a lot of money, or they're really smart, or whatever the case may be. Maybe they're really a good athlete. The point is that when we get in the social world and we observe these outcomes, there are all sorts of forces that come together. We would call that complex causality. Homelessness is exhibit A for complex causality. Right? I have interviewed hundreds of people experiencing homelessness throughout my research career, and I will tell you each story is unique. And so I'm not going to pretend to tell you that I can chart the causal pathway to homelessness, because in each case it's unique and different. Everyone's story is different. Everyone's story is uniquely tragic. And so I don't try to pretend on an individual basis to answer that question, because I think it's difficult. We can talk about trends, we can talk about existing research, and that's important. But the reality is that this is a very complex phenomenon that has complex causes. And so this comes to light if you're reading the Seattle Times, and this data appeared in the Seattle Times a couple of years ago. Each year, our county, Seattle King County, our region conducts a census. We count the number of people using the best estimates that we have available to us and the best methods that we have available to us. We count the number of people experiencing homelessness. And as part of that census, we also have survey questions. We ask people about a whole range of different issues. But one of them is what led you to be homeless? And so when this gets reported in the newspaper, we say, well, we asked people what the causes of homelessness are, and this is what we got. Job loss, alcohol and drug use, eviction, divorce, inability to pay rent, arguments with family and friends. And when I see this list, I always cringe a little bit and kind of scratch my head, because I just think, I don't necessarily buy that this is the root cause of homelessness, because if divorce were a cause of homelessness, we should have a heck of a lot more homelessness. 50% of marriages end in divorce. And so I also don't want to be the person sitting in my office at the University of Washington telling people experiencing homelessness that they're wrong, right? That is not wise either, okay? And so as I've thought about this for the last 5 years, what I have come to think, the way I've come to think about this is there's a difference between a root cause of homelessness and a precipitating event, an event that might precipitate a bout of homelessness. I would consider a lot of these things to be precipitating events. Okay. A job loss for a given person in a given context can certainly lead to homelessness. If I were to be fired by the University of Washington tomorrow, I would likely not be homeless. Well, I know I wouldn't be, at least for some time. Right? So the point is that precipitating events can occur for some people and cause homelessness, and for some other people, it's a nuisance or a disruption in life. Right? And that could be an argument with a family and friend. It could be an argument with your roommate. It could be a health scare. It could be addiction. Okay. And so the point is that we end up as a society focusing on precipitating events that are individually focused, and sometimes ignore some of the underlying root causes, which explain why certain precipitating events produce homelessness in Seattle, but not in other places. So the visual here that that I use to help explain this idea of causation at a community level versus an individual level is a game of musical chairs. So hopefully you're familiar with this game, 10 people, 10 chairs. A leader presses play on the record player, or what used to be a record player, and then music starts. And the leader pulls one chair out, and we now have 9 chairs and 10 people. When the music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone is left without a chair. Okay. In this hypothetical, Mike is on crutches after spraining his ankle, and given his condition, he was unable to move quickly, and he ends up losing the game. He ends up without a chair when the music stops. And so if there was a reporter there and said, why did Mike lose the game? Why did Mike end up chairless? Mike probably would say, well, I had a bad ankle, right? And other people who won would probably say, well, yeah, Mike had a bad ankle, and therefore it's obvious that he would lose. Okay. And so if we were to say, are sprained ankles the reason for losing the game of musical chairs in the specific set of circumstances and rules of that game? Yeah, that's a fair assessment. But another assessment is if we had 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. It might have taken him longer than other people, but he would have found a chair. And so what's happening, I think, in our community in Seattle is we, in essence, have a game of musical chairs in the housing market. And when we don't have enough units, people with vulnerabilities end up losing that game. And then we end up focusing on those vulnerabilities rather than the fundamental and obvious answer, which is if we had enough housing units, a lot of these folks would be housed. And we see that in other communities where housing is far cheaper and more abundant. Okay. And so these vulnerabilities, individual vulnerabilities, be they addiction, be they poverty, be they mental illness, be they job loss or some other circumstance, I consider them to be a sorting mechanism. They identify people to lose this game, right? And I'm not suggesting that this is a game, but I'm using this analogy, okay? So we know, and research has demonstrated this very clearly, that drug use, mental illness, and poverty increase the risk of homelessness at the individual level. No doubt about it. Okay, so I will not stand up and say that drug use isn't related to homelessness. I do not believe drug use is the root cause of homelessness. Does it increase the risk at the individual level? It certainly does. Okay, but what's important is, why do these conditions produce homelessness in some contexts like Seattle and not others? That is the point of the book. Right? So the question that we ask and answer in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? So on a per capita basis, Seattle has 4 to 5 times the rate of homelessness of Chicago. Why is that? Is it because we have more people with these vulnerabilities? So that's what we're testing in the book. The short answer is no, that's not the reason. We don't have a disproportionate number of people who are vulnerable. In fact, we have, in many cases, fewer people who are vulnerable. But the consequences of vulnerability in a very, very expensive place like Seattle are very dire. And it usually means in the form of homelessness. So this is a book about cities, not about people. And that's not to suggest that people experiencing homelessness aren't important. They absolutely are. And there's a lot of good research and writing on that, and that should continue. But the point of this book is, what the heck is going on here in Seattle, and San Francisco and LA and Boston and New York and DC, places where homelessness is really abundant. Okay. And the thesis is that tight housing markets where housing is expensive and where housing is not terribly available, accentuate vulnerabilities and produce disproportionate rates of homelessness. And these individual vulnerabilities serve as a sorting mechanism to identify people who will likely be without housing in these tight housing markets. So to set the stage, just so you have a sense for the variation that we're talking about, this is based on 2019 data. And the one thing that I want to highlight for you is, and this is some bureaucratic complexity, the way that we count homelessness in the United States is through these administrative units called continuums of care. And each local jurisdiction can determine the boundaries for their COCs. That's the abbreviation that we use. And so some of those COCs are simply the borders of a city, like New York City. The New York COC covers the city of New York, and that's it. Same with Washington, DC, San Francisco, Boston, Atlanta. Okay. Other ones have chosen, for whatever reason, and that's not really important for tonight, to have a broader geographic coverage to include the full county. King County is included in that category. And so what happens is that when we count the number of people experiencing homelessness in King County, we are including the entire county. It's people in the city and all the county. And so generally speaking, county-based COCs will have lower homelessness per capita because you are including suburban locations that tend to have lower rates of homelessness. Okay, so when we compare jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it's really important to compare cities to cities and counties to counties. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a false reading. Okay, to suggest that Atlanta has a worse homelessness problem than King County is absolutely false, even though the Atlanta number is higher than King County. Right. Okay. What's also interesting on this, and so what we see is on the x-axis here, the horizontal axis is this is homelessness per 1,000 people. Well, you'll see New York, Washington, San Francisco, and Boston are between 9 and 10 homeless people per 1,000. And that's about 5 times Chicago and Indianapolis, which are on the low end. They're about 2. When you shift to the counties, the numbers are lower, as I said, because of this suburban dynamic. But what's also interesting is you basically have a 5-to-1 ratio between the high per capita counties and the low per capita counties. So you have LA County, Santa Clara, King County, and then Multnomah, which is Portland at the top end. And then you see some Florida, Ohio, Illinois counties on the left. So the sample for the book is these 30 large metro areas in the country, and then we compare within counties and cities to try to understand this variation. And so 5-to-1 is a lot, right? That's a huge amount of variation, and therefore that's the purpose of the book. So we spend a chapter on a bunch of different explanations, 3 different categories of explanations that are commonly understood to be drivers of homelessness. And what we do is we try to test it statistically to see, does this help to explain why New York is 5 times Chicago in terms of rates of homelessness? So we start with individual explanations because these are the most prevalent that we read about and observe and hear about. And the first one, the most obvious individual risk factor for homelessness is poverty. If you are impoverished, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. And so do we just have a lot of poor people here, which explains our rates of homelessness? The answer is no. So the only statistics I'm going to include for you tonight is this notion of R squared. And before your eyes glaze over, all this is doing is basically trying to explain variation in rates of homelessness. Okay, so as R squared gets closer to 1, this measure is saying we're explaining a lot of the variation in rates of homelessness. As R squared gets close to 0, we're going to say there's very little relationship. Okay, and in the social sciences, because of this complexity, if we can get numbers that are 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, we start to say, hey, there's a relationship here that's interesting. We're starting to explain some of this variation. Okay, if that number is very close to 0, what we're basically going to say is it doesn't really help us explain anything. So in this case, we've got R squared of 0.14 and 0.17, which are modest relationships. It's worth taking note of. But the most important thing here is it's in the opposite direction of what we would expect. What we see here is that places with very high rates of poverty have low rates of homelessness. And that's true in both cities and counties. So it's not that we have more people living below the poverty line in Seattle. In fact, we have fewer. Right? And these bubbles over here are cities for each year in our sample. And so this is Detroit over here. Right? Detroit's the most impoverished city. I mean, huge. Look at these poverty rates. 35, 40% of the people in that city are below the federal poverty line, yet they have rates of homelessness that are far, far less than many other communities. Okay, so the idea that a disproportionate number of people who are poor in your city causes homelessness is categorically false. In fact, what we see is homelessness thrives in relatively affluent cities and counties. Okay, and so King County would be over in this region here. Very, very low rates of poverty, 10%-ish. And relatively high rates of homelessness. At the federal level, we end up, our data on mental illness and drugs are captured at the state level. So we actually shift to state level measures here, but it's the same logic, which is this is every state in the country between 2007 and 2019. Rates of homelessness on the left here. We'll see that some places have lots of homelessness, some have less or lower rates. And then we do see some variation in rates of serious mental illness. But what's interesting is you just see dots all over the graph, and the R squared is 0.05, which means there's 0 relationship. So we don't see higher rates of homelessness in places with higher rates of serious mental illness. Right? So it's not that Washington has a disproportionate amount of mental illness, and therefore we have lots of homelessness. We see no relationship at all. This is rates of illicit drug use, again, at the state level. Again, R squared is 0.06, basically no relationship. Right, there's some places with more illicit drug use, there's some places with less, but generally speaking, statistically speaking, there's almost no relationship. Right, so we can't claim disproportionate numbers of illicit drug users for high rates of homelessness. This is substance use disorder, which would include illicit drugs, but as well as legal drugs like alcohol or marijuana, depending on your jurisdiction, right? And we measure if there are substance use disorders. Again, almost no relationship statistically speaking. Okay, so it's not disproportionate people with, it's not disproportionate numbers of those people in our community or in our state that explain rates of homelessness. Okay, so there's something else going on here. I hear all the time, and if I had a nickel for every time I heard this, that there's something just unique about Seattle. There's something that we're doing here. There's something about our conditions, our context that are producing this. So we wanted to address this. The first one is weather. I will say that next to drugs, people will say weather to me more often than anything else when we talk about homelessness. And so this is all back to now our cities, our communities, the 30 largest cities in the United States. And this is based on January temperature, which is when we do the census, the homeless census. What we see here is that there are cold places and there are warm places, and there is zero relationship, literally zero relationship between weather and homelessness. Okay? And so I think for a lot of people, we think about LA and San Diego and say, well, of course, nice weather, there are gonna be a lot of homeless people there. But they don't think about Miami and Dallas and Phoenix and other places that have very reasonable, moderate weather in January and don't have problems with homelessness. And we don't think about New York and Boston and Minneapolis, places that are terribly cold in January that don't have big problems with homelessness. Okay, now the difference between sheltered and unsheltered, there is a weather relationship, and we talk about that in the book, right? But the point is, in terms of total homelessness, which is the number of people in shelters and those who are unsheltered, there's no relationship between temperature and rates of total homelessness. The other argument we frequently hear is that generous benefits serve as a magnet or a pull factor for homelessness to a particular community. And so what we do here is we look at the primary welfare benefit program in the United States, which is called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It primarily goes to women and children. And it has a huge variation state by state, because when welfare reform was put into place in '96, when Clinton was president, part of the deal was states got to determine their benefits. So there are some states that are pretty stingy, some that are quite generous. Okay. And to get a sense for the purchasing power of that benefit, we divide by just housing costs, 2-bedroom rent in that particular state. And again, we're looking at rates of homelessness, but we actually are looking at rates of family homelessness here, because this is a family-focused benefit, to see if there's some relationship between generous benefits, the purchasing power of those benefits, and homelessness. And again, what we see, R-squared 0.01, no relationship. There are some really stingy places and there are some very generous places, but it has zero relationship to rates of homelessness. The other way that we can think about this in our cities is to look at rates of low-income migration, because I frequently hear, well, people are just moving here. Poor people are moving here and they become homeless. And so what we do here is we look at the migration of people below the federal poverty line into each of these cities in each of the years in our sample. And what we see is that, like with poverty, there's an inverse relationship, meaning the higher the in-migration of poverty, the lower the rates of homelessness. And the places where you have really high rates of homelessness in both the cities and the counties are places with very, very low levels of low-income migration. Okay, we don't see a lot of poor people moving to New York and Boston and DC and Seattle and San Francisco. Why? Because it's almost impossible to get your feet on the ground, right? We actually see a lot more low-income migration in places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and Detroit, places that tend to be a little bit more affordable. Okay, so this magnet effect doesn't really hold up when we test it statistically. And the last one is politics. Governor Newsom in California and President Trump, I think in 2020, got into a big fight about the responsibility for homelessness between the state of California and the federal government. Right? And Trump was blaming Democratic mayors and governors, and Newsom was blaming federal retrenchment and housing policy, and so not unlike a lot of the political narratives, that kind of blew up. But it's interesting, a lot of people will say, well, it's generally left-leaning kind of permissive policies in cities that explain homelessness. And sure enough, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, all left-leaning cities, right? There's no doubt about it. But what's interesting is when we expanded to all the 30 metro areas in our sample, we actually looked and saw in each year in our sample over the 12 years, who was in charge. And Democrats were in charge 85% of the time. Generally speaking, American cities are run by Democrats. Okay, Republicans 8% of the time, independents 7% of the time. So the cities where there were Republicans, I think, was San Diego and Miami, if I remember correctly, and then independence was Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York. Okay, and so the point is that if Democratic policies are to blame, why don't we have a huge homelessness problem in Chicago and Cleveland, right, which are huge Democratic strongholds? Okay? And so again, it's tough to really blame these specific left-leaning policies because ultimately we don't see this in other places that have similar ideologies among their elected leaders. And so the final category of arguments that we make is housing market explanations. And so when you plot, and this is using the same set of cities and counties, when we plot absolute contract rent, so this is median contract rent for each of the cities in our sample, what we start to see is much higher R-squareds, and the relationship is positive, meaning as rents go up, homelessness goes up. It's the only variable in our book that starts to show some explanatory power. Okay, a related variable is vacancy rates, which is looking at rental market vacancy rates. And what you see here is that when vacancy rates get below 5%, which is considered to be kind of the break even between a loose and a tight market, once you get below that 5% number, what you'll see is much, much higher rates of homelessness. And that's true in both cities and counties. And so after looking at all this, if you were just to blindfold me and give me the median contract rent and the vacancy rate for a particular city, I could tell you with a pretty high degree of confidence whether you're going to have a problem with homelessness or not. The data is pretty compelling. And so you might say, well, okay, so why do we have high rents and low vacancies? If that's the issue, why do we have that? Maybe it's because a bunch of people are moving to Seattle and these other cities. And that certainly could be the explanation. But what's interesting is when we plot population change against homelessness, we don't see any relationship. And this is the most surprising statistic that I had when I was running the numbers for this book. This shocked me. I actually did it 3 times because I thought I messed it up. Okay. And actually, when I got in and started looking at city to city, what I found is there are a lot of really fast growing places in the United States. Charlotte, North Carolina has grown as fast as King County. It's Mecklenburg County, but Mecklenburg and King have grown at a very similar rate in the last 12 years. But they don't have a problem with homelessness. Austin has grown really fast. Phoenix, the Sun Belt generally has grown quite quickly. And so the point is that is population growth a risk factor? No doubt about it. But there's something else going on. There's something that's differentiating Seattle and San Francisco from Charlotte, North Carolina. And the answer to that is housing supply response. Okay, so I only gave you one statistical measure, and I'm only going to give you this economics. And so you can zone out if you want to. But there's a notion in the field of economics called housing supply elasticity. The idea is when the price of a good changes, how much will suppliers produce in response? Okay, so this pen right here, if the price of this pen, which is maybe 50 cents or $1, went up to $20 tonight, what would happen tomorrow? Producers of pens would start to make pens like you've never seen because it's a profit opportunity for them. So we would say the elasticity, the supply elasticity of pens is really high. When the price changes, you see they would flood the market. Okay. Housing is very different. If the price of housing in Seattle goes up 10 times tonight, what happens tomorrow? Nothing changes. Why? Because it takes a long time to build housing. You have to get land, you have to get a contractor, you have to get a permit, et cetera. So generally speaking, the supply response for housing is lower than for a lot of other goods and services. But within the country, from city to city, what we see is big variation in supply responses. And it's largely driven by 2 factors. One is topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to expand your housing supply. You can't build on mountains, you can't build on water. Okay. And the regulatory environment in which you operate, zoning, et cetera, how easy it is to get a permit, what can you build here, what can't you build there, how long does it take? That regulatory environment also determines your supply response. And so what we see is when we start to plot and think about supply response with the changes in population, we actually plot this on a graph here. And so on the left here, housing supply elasticity, 1 is considered neutral. Numbers above 1 would suggest that you have a very responsive housing supply, meaning when prices go up, you'll build a lot of housing. And so this is places like St. Louis and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin and Charlotte. The regulatory environment is accommodating and they don't really have topographical barriers. When you get below 1, you would say you have a constrained housing supply. And this is where you have regulation and topographical constraints. You can see every one of these cities borders water, and many of them have mountains as well. Okay. So when you plot that against population change, what you observe, and the numbers in parentheses are rental market vacancy rates. It gives you a sense for how tight the market is. So this quadrant in the lower right, which is rapid population growth and very inelastic housing supply, is the perfect storm for a housing crisis. And we know that there are housing crises in Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle, so this isn't surprising, but we also see their vacancy rates are super low because a lot of people have moved there and we haven't built a lot of housing. The upper right quadrant is the Sun Belt, which is rapid population growth, but because of their supply elasticity, they build a whole bunch of housing. And as a result, look at these vacancy rates, 8, 9, 7, 6, much, much higher than what you see down here. And as a result, they do not experience the same housing crises that these cities do. Okay, and on the left, it doesn't matter if people are leaving your city, which is basically the Rust Belt story. They have declining population, so your supply response doesn't matter because you already have the housing's built and people are leaving, so you're going to have more housing. And as a result, you see higher vacancy rates. So the point here is we reside in this lower right corner, which is the worst of all possible worlds if you're trying to address a housing crisis. And it's not a coincidence then that we have really, really high prices, low vacancy rates, and a problem with homelessness. So what do we do? Ultimately, I believe that homelessness is a structural problem. I believe that it can be explained structurally, and therefore a structural problem requires a structural solution. And ultimately that means we need a heck of a lot more housing in our region. Okay, and so right now we've got a lot of operating investments that are providing programs which are necessary. I believe we have a moral duty to provide services to people who need them, but that alone will not fix this problem. Right? Treating people who are addicted, who are mentally ill, who are experiencing homelessness is the right thing to do. It will not end the crisis. What will end this crisis is housing. And therefore, we also need capital investments, and that may come from public sources, it might come from private sources, but ultimately we need more money to construct more housing. And where housing is difficult to construct, as it is in San Francisco and Seattle, we need to have changes in the way we think about land use policy and the regulations, related regulations, to ensure that we can start to construct the housing density that we need to accommodate all the people who want to live in this amazing region. Okay. What's one of the perverse aspects of this story is many of the attributes and amenities that make Seattle an amazing place to live, which is mountains and water, make it particularly difficult to accommodate all the people who want to live here because of those amenities. It's this kind of vicious cycle. People say, oh, what a beautiful place. I want to move there. Well, and now we can't actually accommodate those folks, right? And so the fact that we have 70% of residential parcels zoned single family in Seattle doesn't work. The math simply doesn't work. We can't jam everyone who wants to move here into 30% of the multifamily parcels. And so this will change. It's just a matter of time, and it will be a painful process. But it will change. Seattle is now a global city. It needs to look like a global city. Right? And if you travel, if you've been fortunate enough to travel the world, what you'll see is global cities don't look like Seattle, right? They tend to be much more dense. People don't have single family homes in Manhattan or in Tokyo, right? It's not even something we think about, right? Because you're living in the city. And so what we have is cities like Minneapolis and Chicago and Seattle, which still have lots of single family homes. And now that presents a challenge when we start to grow. And so that's what we're going to see. And we're certainly hearing it now in the session in Olympia right now, is we're debating, how do we think about this? It becomes a really important point. And so in terms of dollars, yes, housing is expensive, which is one of the reasons why we haven't done it. McKinsey, the global consultancy, did a report, and they suggested that fixing this problem for the extremely low income households in our region would cost about $1 billion a year for 10 years. So let's call it $10 billion over 10 years. It's a lot of money, 4 times what we're spending right now. Okay. But when you put that in context, our region just approved $54 billion for transit over the next 25 years. Right? And our tabs were a little more expensive when we got them, but generally speaking, nothing happened. And our economy didn't die. We ended up, and we made that investment because we view it as a public good. And so one of the challenges with housing is we view housing as a private good, but transportation as a public good. And therefore we're reluctant to spend public dollars on housing, but we are willing to spend public dollars on transportation. And that's a disconnect that ultimately, and I think we're starting to see, we see Amazon and Microsoft investing their own corporate capital in housing. Why? Because it's an existential threat to their businesses if people can't afford to live and work near their offices, right? And so they're doing something that they would never have thought about doing, which is using corporate money to build housing. Okay. And so our region needs to think about this the same way, which is this is an existential threat for our region. If third grade teachers in the Seattle public school system can't afford to live near where they teach, we can't have teachers driving 2 hours to teach third grade. And you can't have a viable community without third grade teachers or police officers or firefighters or other service workers. And so while this housing crisis acutely affects people experiencing homelessness, it's the same crisis that many of us have experienced or our kids are experiencing when they try to live and work in Seattle. And so we ultimately just need a heck of a lot more housing. And it needs to be, we need more market rate housing, we need more affordable housing, we need more supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. And so when people say, well, which kind of housing should we build? I always say D, all the above. And one of those alone will not be sufficient. We can't just build more, $800,000 condos and fix this problem. Do we need those? Yes, we do, because the demand for those are still really high. That alone will not do it. Only building affordable housing and not building market rate is also insufficient. We need to do all of it. And so I want all of my developer friends out there building and building and building apartments, building condos, whatever they can do. We need more density, more units. And then we also need nonprofit, we need philanthropy, we need the public sector to be thinking about how do we create the affordable units that we need. And so ultimately, the ray of light in all this is we have cut veterans homelessness in the United States by half over the last decade. Okay, we can end homelessness. We have, and we are in the process of doing so for veterans. And why did we do it? It's because people of both political parties believe that it was wrong for people who served our country in the armed forces to come back and be homeless. It happened during Vietnam, and it was happening with people returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. And they said, this is wrong. And so what do we do? How do we cut it in half in 10 years? We gave them housing. Okay, it's not a mystery. We know it works. Housing works. The question is whether we will apply that same logic to a broader population. So this is the book. If you're interested, I can get you a discount code. I can have Marcy share this slide with you after the fact. And I want to thank you for your time and attention and spending your Monday night with me. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. I have to tell you, I'm kind of reeling with the concept of housing as a public good. So thank you for that.
Yep.
So I'm gonna invite anybody who has questions to wave their hand or put them in the chat. It looks like we got one in the chat. Oh, just a great presentation. Questions from folks in the audience or shout outs about things that resonated to you. Anna, are you waving your hand?
I am, but I can wait.
No, go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for your presentation. Thanks a lot. I think that it's really important, and I agree with a lot of what you say. I support high density in cities, but I think that there is a disconnect in terms of discussing what our cities of the future are going to look like. And you briefly briefly mentioned the environment at the very, very beginning. And then, we didn't really touch on that afterwards. I already know the main argument for high density in a city is that supposedly it's going to minimize sprawl. I'm not really convinced of that, but either way, I think the issue for me is that when we're talking about what our cities are going to look like in terms of density, we're not talking about the impact on the environment. We're not talking about, how are we going to design, just raising everything to the ground and having a bunch of warehoused people. That's not a livable city. It creates, we know about heat islands. We know that there is a discrepancy in cities that, lower income people end up in areas that are much less livable than people with money. I find that urban planners, economists, housing developers, they're not looking at that holistic approach to what is the kind of life that we want to have in our cities for all income levels. And I really feel like, particularly in Seattle, there is almost like a divide. It's either everything has to be single family and don't ever touch anything, or we've got to cut it all down and have multifamily. Whereas it really needs to be a combination. You can have good design, you can have good living, you can have streets, you can have transit, you can have an urban canopy, but I'm not hearing that discussion. So I'm curious to hear what your take on that is.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree with you. I gave a talk at Boston University right before COVID. Feels like 1 year ago, but it's many years now. And the whole point of this conference at BU was the future of cities, and they were talking about the two risks for these cities are climate change and affordable housing, right? And so they had people from the community, they had researchers talking about this, and the point that I made was I believe that the answer to both these questions are related. I don't believe them to be in conflict, right? There are some people who say we don't want environmental regulations from San Antonio, Texas, and Seattle. I agree. And so at times will we see some conflict between affordable housing developers and the environmental lobby? Potentially. But generally speaking, the answer to a more sustainable city is denser living, transit, right? Not sprawl. I absolutely believe that. And there's abundant evidence to suggest that. When we talk about zoning, what's really important is when we end single family zoning, it doesn't mean we end single family homes, right? What it means is it's no longer illegal to build a fourplex on a parcel of land that used to be single family, right? So Minneapolis just outlawed single family zoning. And if you were to drive around Minneapolis right now, it would look an awful lot like it did 3 years ago. And you might see some more fourplexes. And so the point is not to turn Seattle into Tokyo. It's not going to happen, right? But the point is that over time, there will some homes come down and fourplexes be put up in Seattle if we get rid of single family zoning? Yeah, that'll happen. And frankly, those new buildings will probably be more sustainable than the 70 or 100-year-old homes that were there previously, right? And so there will absolutely be a change in the city. And do I think that we can do so in a sustainable way? Absolutely. And I reside in a college of built environment at the University of Washington, which includes architecture, urban planning, real estate, construction management. And I can tell you the conversations going around about the link between affordable housing and the environment, that is the #1 issue. I'm actually writing a syllabus for a course on that very topic right now. And so the #1 strategy in our recent strategic plan in our college was climate. And how do these disciplines of planning and architecture and construction management and real estate confront the existential threat that climate change presents to our cities? And by the way, we also have to figure out how to house people, right? And it's not building giant warehouses where we put people in, which is the New York model, right? They have 97% of their people in a shelter system that costs billions of dollars a year with no hope of ever getting out. They're warehousing people in these shelter systems. So anyway, it's a very complicated topic, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's absolutely critical. And while at times we might end up in conflict, I believe that everyone is rowing in the same direction here. I don't believe that these solutions are mutually exclusive. I really don't.
I'm going to move on. You have a couple questions in chat. First one's from Emily. What kinds of regulations are we talking about? And what are the incentives for developers to build a variety of housing opportunities?
So the regulations have to deal with one zoning, as we talked about, but getting permits, setbacks, there are a whole host of issues in terms of how homes must be constructed in California and Washington that are more restrictive. And so there are a range of those that are, I think, that could be made without having a major impact on sustainable building. What kind of incentives for developers to build a variety of housing opportunities? Well, ultimately, we need to have some kinds of incentives to help developers build housing that's affordable, because ultimately, given the cost of land, materials, and labor, it's very difficult to build housing that's affordable to people who are making $40,000 a year in Seattle. It just doesn't work. And so ultimately, there will need to be some type of subsidy. Right. I'm a market person. Someone accused me of being a socialist recently, which I kind of laughed about. I don't believe I'm a socialist. I do believe there's a role for the government in helping to construct affordable housing. I don't think that makes me a socialist. I just think that makes me someone who thinks there's a role for government. I do. And so right now, the primary way that we incent developers to build affordable housing is through a program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which is a federal program that provides tax credits to developers to build affordable housing. It's terribly efficient, and it's frankly not the way I would design it, but it's the only game in town, therefore I support it. And so yes, there's a variety of ways that we need to do that. But if we put our heads in the stand, kind of the ostrich strategy, and just say, we'll let the market figure this out, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So there do need to be some sort of incentives.
Okay, 3 from Barb. I'll do them one at a time. First one, what surprised you the most in your findings?
I would say the growth chart that I mentioned was really surprising. The other one that really surprised me was rent burden, which is rent divided by income. I mean, the percentage of income that you're spending on your rent did not predict homelessness. Rent burdens in Detroit and Cleveland are almost as high as they are in Seattle. That really surprised me, in San Francisco. And so the point is that the market scales to whatever the incomes are in a particular area. So we don't have a problem here because our rent burdens are higher, meaning that we're spending more of our income on housing. The problem we have here is the absolute number is higher. So that was really interesting to me. So those are two surprises.
Okay. Next question, what are the major obstacles to obtaining funds for capital and operating investments in Seattle?
Politics.
Probably enough said.
Yep.
What do you think will happen here?
Well, I was telling Marcy when I first got on, I did an interview with the Seattle Magazine today, and he asked me, am I optimistic? And I paused for probably a minute before answering because I don't know my honest answer to that. I would say that there are reasons to be optimistic, but there are also reasons to be pessimistic. I'll start with pessimism and then we can end on a slightly more optimistic note. My fear is that because the scale of this problem is growing the way it is, and the resources we have to fix it are not there, that this will continue to get worse and public support for investments will continue to wane. And that's what scares me the most, is that people will then begin to say that the bureaucratic infrastructure that we've created to respond to this crisis has failed, and therefore let's starve the beast. No more money for that. In which case, I think we will accelerate this crisis beyond what we could even imagine right now. That's what scares me. And part of the reason why I wanted to write this book is to kind of reorient people around the idea that what we're doing right now is great, but it's not sufficient to the scale of the problem. What is potentially a silver lining in all this is, generally speaking, when you think about public policy in the United States, not just housing, but all public policy, if you were to track when all these things happen, it's during times of major crises, right? Our welfare state was created during the Great Depression in the 1930s, right? The next great wave of social policy in the United States happened in the 1960s. Right. And then if you think about the last 20 years, the major legislations that we've passed of fiscal stimulus in the economy have been during the Great Recession and during COVID. Right. And so in Seattle, I think the scale of this problem will get to the point where people absolutely lose patience, which will increase the likelihood that we will make larger investments. Now, it could cut either way. It could either people say, I'm done, I'm out, I'm moving, or I'm not supporting these candidates anymore, or people finally recognizing that, hey, there is a relationship between our housing market and homelessness here, and therefore we need to intervene with meaningful investments. And so I don't know if that's a silver lining or not, but I do think when things get bad enough, we start to see action. And I think we're certainly getting there, right? That if you look at just the amount of discussion, both political and in the press, about this issue in the last 5 years, it is accelerating, right? And that will change public opinion, and I think it is going to also change political action.
Monica wants to know density. What else does density bring with it, especially in pandemic times, in regards to infrastructure that exists, climate impact, and are there examples of cities that do density well? And Libby's also asking what cities are doing it well.
Yeah,
who's successful?
Yeah, so I think there are two separate questions there. One is around density, what cities do that well, and then there's another question of what cities are doing it well from Libby, which might be around homelessness, which is a slightly different answer. So I'm going to attack the first one, then Libby, you can correct me if I'm interpreting your question incorrectly. In terms of what does density bring with it, obviously, well, people are moving here. And so unless we put up a wall and Amazon and Microsoft start hiring people, people are going to continue to move here. And in a free society, we basically allow people to move wherever they want to move. Okay. And so we can either respond to that growth or we cannot. And my point is that I don't see anything that I've read from people who think about this, that the growth in Seattle is going to end. Okay. And therefore we have an issue of what do we do? Do we sprawl over the mountains? Do we sprawl north? Do we sprawl south? Part of our response is a huge investment in transit, which is incredibly important. I'm grateful we're doing it. But ultimately, the urban core here will need to densify. And if every person who comes here has 2 cars and we build a bunch of high rises and people are driving around, yeah, this may not be a city that we want to live in, but I think the reality is people are going to start living more like they do in a lot of other cities where they don't have cars and they take the train or the subway or whatever it is, and they go to work and they live a really nice life. And so I don't believe that increased density means that we are going to become, an enemy of the environment or an inhospitable place to live, right? There are plenty of cities, particularly in Europe, that are far more dense than our cities that have done a really good job of building a sustainable city, right? From an environmental footprint, are probably doing far better than we are right now. Okay, if you've been in European cities and see people, these brand new buildings that are green, they're very, very sustainable, and a bunch of people are riding bikes, right? Amsterdam. Okay. So I don't know that increased density needs to be bad. Could it be done poorly? Absolutely. Could it be done in a way that we regret? There's no question about it, but I don't think it has to be. So Libby's question, what cities are doing it well from a homelessness perspective? This is a harder one to answer because the reality is places that are doing well have some innate advantages that Seattle doesn't have. And my favorite story about this is when I was working on my PhD in Minneapolis, Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis is based, was going to fly people to Dayton, Ohio, because Dayton, Ohio was having great success in homelessness. Well, let's figure out the magic, the silver bullet that Dayton, Ohio has. And so they sent 2 people on a plane. They flew to Dayton. They spent a day with them. They came back the next day. And I said, so how was it? And they said, well, we're a little embarrassed. And I said, why is that? And I said, well, we sat down, and in the first hour we said, well, how are you getting all these people housed? And they said, well, we get them signed up for federal welfare benefits, which is $760 a month. And then we can get them in an apartment because we have 12% vacancies and it costs $500 a month. Okay. So I'm not making fun of Dayton. I'm grateful that Dayton was using the resources at their disposal to fix the problem. That's great. The reality is, though, you can't take the Dayton playbook and apply it to Seattle. Okay, you get someone $750 a month and the apartment is going to cost what, $1,500 a month? Okay, it doesn't work. Okay, so the point is, where we're having success with homelessness tends to be because they have accommodating housing markets. And sometimes that's not their own doing. Generally speaking, the cheapest places in the country are places where we've had industrial decline. Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Buffalo. No one there said, hey, let's have all of our manufacturing base leave so that people leave and home prices fall and it's really affordable. That's not what Detroit signed up for. It's what they got, and they have a lot of problems. So I'm not suggesting we all should be Detroit. They have a lot of problems. Homelessness isn't one of them. Right. So to Libby's question, are there cities that are expensive that have done a really good job of getting out in front of this? Not really. Not really. I'm hoping in the next 10 years we'll have some examples there. California, Washington, Oregon, Minneapolis, places are leading the charge on zoning and really thinking aggressively about how do we construct more housing. And so I hope we'll have some examples there. But generally speaking, the expensive coastal cities are failing is a strong word, but are not succeeding when it comes to the fight against homelessness.
I think that was all the questions that we had in chat. Is there anybody else that has a question? I'll take the spotlight off and we can just check, wave your hand or put your hand up if you do. I think we got them all. There are a lot of you on this call.
Marcy?
Oh, yep.
Don Pornoff.
Go ahead, Don.
There's a state mandated plan for planning, which I believe includes affordable housing, which extends pretty much from Everett, Marysville, all the way down to Olympia, and probably beyond that. Have you studied any part of that, Dr. Colburn?
I have been involved in some conversations with the Puget Sound Regional Council around those topics. I know that bill exists. I don't know what all the details are, but I am aware of generally a lot of the state level initiatives around this idea. And there's a lot of good stuff. I will say there are a bunch of really interesting good bills being debated in Olympia in this session right now, which 3 or 4 years ago probably wouldn't even gotten a hearing in committee, and now they are. And so there's real movement.
I'm thinking about the ability of Seattle to be able to show that there are other cities close by where people can live. Mm-hmm. And commute into town if they want to. I live in Linwood. That's one of them.
Yep. And I think light rail is the means by which that will occur. right? The prospect of living in Everett and working in Seattle never existed before, but now it does, especially if you've got 2 days working remote and 3 days a week, you jump on the train down to Seattle. That is a viable life for a lot of people, in the next 20 years that didn't exist previously. And I think that's huge for our region. It's huge for our region. I was just teaching today in urban economics class when we were talking about COVID and whether this is the death of the cities. I don't believe it is, right? I still think cities are going to thrive, but good investments in transit and some remote work, whether it's a day or 2 a week, could change the way we think about this. And so not everyone's going to need to live in Salt Lake Union if they work for Amazon. They may not want to. Some people will. It's a nice place, but not everyone will need to. So yeah, but I will say transit is the linchpin there. Without that, this regional strategy doesn't work.
Okay, I think we have one last question. Roger Werner, you get to ask it.
Where do we start on policy change in this area?
I would say all the different bills that are looking at supply of housing is the place to start. And so that there's a regulatory piece in terms of how we zone and permit things. And then there's just a resource issue in terms of how do we allocate resources to the construction of housing that can't be built by the market. And there are all sorts of policy recommendations around that area. But if I had to highlight 2 things, the final thing I would say is the best. Also, we shouldn't give up on Washington, D.C. I guess is my last answer to that. There are debates going on in Washington, D.C. right now, which I have been a part of at a national level around housing vouchers, which is the primary federal housing subsidy, right? We give people a voucher, they go into the market and give it to their landlord. Right now, 1 in 5 people in the United States who are eligible for federal housing assistance get it. So it's a lottery. You wait 10 years and finally your name comes up and you get a voucher. The problem with the voucher program is 1, there's not enough of them. We need 5 times more. And then 2, in a place like Seattle, people will get a voucher and then spend 60 days trying to find a unit. And then half the people will turn it back in unused. It's like winning the lottery and then not cashing your ticket because they can't find a landlord who will take it. So ultimately, what I've said in these national meetings is if we made vouchers universal, meaning everyone who's eligible gets it, like food stamps. If you are eligible for food stamps, you get it. Housing assistance is not the same. If we made it similar to housing food assistance, meaning everyone who's eligible gets it, that is great. And that would be a huge boost of purchasing power for poor households in the United States, a game changer. But in a place like Seattle, that's not alone. What we need to then pair that with is a local commitment to constructing housing to ensure that there are places for people to live. And once that purchasing power exists through the vouchers, it makes it a lot easier for developers to build housing that people can be in, right? Because they can pay market rents with the benefit of this voucher. And so my hope is that the federal government will play, because if the federal government does that, it makes everything that we're trying to do in this region a lot easier. Which is why, if you look through history, the federal government has played an incredibly important role in providing housing for people, because the resources of the federal government far exceed than anything that exists in Olympia or King County or the city of Seattle. And so the problem is to a certain extent, the feds have divorced themselves from this issue for the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, and left it to states and cities and counties, which just frankly don't have the resources to do it, which is why we're struggling here. If we have to, can we get there? Sure, but it sure would be nice to have a little assistance from Uncle Sam.
Okay, I want to just do a logistic check. Greg, I've had a couple of requests for sharing your slides. Are you comfortable if I make it a PDF? Can we share those?
I'm not allowed to do that per
Okay.
my publisher, unfortunately.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
I've also had requests for this recording. So we did record the session. If you are on the Magnolia UCC mailing list, the link will be in Thursday's MailChimp, and then you're welcome to forward it to folks. If you are not on that mailing list, I'm going to put my email in the chat. You can just drop me a line if you need a recording of it, and I'll email it to you, okay? It's just marcy@magnoliaucc.org, and I'll share that recording with you if you would like a copy of that. So if you're on our mailing list though, and you get our MailChimps, you'll see it on Thursday and you can share that. So I want to do 2 housekeepings. First of all, our next session is going to be on Monday, February 28th at 7 p.m. via Zoom, and the topic is what is critical race theory and why are people so upset about it? So Dr. Cheryl Cook is coming back. Some of you are familiar with Dr. Cook. She worked with us last year around some of our anti-racism work, and she's going to be coming back and talking about critical race theory. And Dr. Cook came out of academia, and some of her research is in particular Black women in academia. So it'll be a great topic. I hope you can join us for that. And again, if you're not on our mailing list and want an invitation to that, I will send it out to the conference as well. So, or you can drop me an email. So I want to say thank you so much for coming to Dr. Colburn. This was a great presentation. I think we're all walking away with multiple ahas. So thank you to Dr. Colburn. And I did put the link in the chat for his book that's coming out for pre-order and the 30% off coupon. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Be well and good night.
Good night. Thank you all.